I don't know if we're supposed to wait for Alex to get here to reintroduce me, but by now I don't think I'm a stranger to any of you. I may be the force you don't want to see in a dark alley, but at least you know who to avoid. And I'm aware that I have to finish my talk, and then we have to go through the book launch before you can get the reception. So I'm going to cut some slides and start right away. Just as with the talk before the break, I don't intend to cover all the challenges of ocean science in 60 minutes. I'm not going to give you a shopping list of everything that every group of scientists I know argues with good reason needs to be done. I'll spend a few minutes making us all think a little bit again about what are the challenges to science that are special about the ocean, that aren't challenges to science and environmental science and sustainable use of human activities everywhere. And then look at what ocean science tries to do to address those particularly ocean challenges. And particularly the things we try to do to not just produce ocean science results, but actually make them both interesting and relevant to policymakers. Now, most people don't stop to think of the fact that when we look at the terrestrial world around us, we understand a lot of how it works because we live on land. That presents the challenge of having to constantly control the desire to anthropomorphize things that nature is doing and give it a human personality. But we can manage that and still understand by analogy to what we experience, what we see, and it does work as we perceive it. Science still has a role in terrestrial ecology, terrestrial land use management, because we do quantify things in ways that make it much easier to explain what we experience and explain to decision makers of many kinds why some things are opportunities, some things are definitely undesirable outcomes. Now, the ocean is fundamentally different than the land in some important ways. There's a lot of physical properties. And it's not just that it's a lot bigger than land. And we don't really appreciate that because we're usually asleep on the airplane when we're flying over the biggest parts of it. But it is 70% of the Earth's surface. And 97% when you look at volume rather than just area. Look at that third dimension. 97% of the water on the planet is in the ocean. All that fresh water we live off is 3% of it. The deepest parts of the ocean are 25% deeper than the highest elevations on land. And that's amplified tremendously because on land, almost everything that matters to life occurs within a few hundred meters above the land surface wherever you are, or a few tens of meters below it. Birds fly higher, but in terms of life processes, there's a pretty narrow shell of land and air to understand. In the ocean, there is life from the ocean surface to the deepest parts of the ocean. It's got a three-dimensionality to it and a mobility to that third dimension that you just never have to think of on land. And we're not used to thinking of nature working that way. A lot of thinking about nature that comes from habitat being static on land doesn't apply when you go to the ocean. And we can understand that intellectually, but we then don't apply that intellectual understanding to what we actually perceive and think about the problems we have to solve and the things that may or may not be solutions to those problems. And there's little details like a little factoid you can take home if you didn't already know. The top 10 meters of the ocean surface contains as much heat as the entire world's atmosphere. And then you've got all the rest of the ocean. This gives the ocean a role in climate dynamics that is just staggeringly different than land and air. You add that to the biological differences. Different taxonomies have different numbers of phyla of animals on land. When you get to plants and other things that are neither plants nor animals, it gets even more weird. But a taxonomy I commonly use, of the 36 phyla that it represents, 19 of those, nearly 2/3, only live in the ocean. There's a lot of life in the ocean, animal life, that is just different in basic ways than life on land. There's a lot of radially symmetrical marine life. The neurosystem, the thing that one would call a brain in radially symmetrical organisms, it diverged from the nervous system and the thing that would become a brain in bilaterally symmetrical organisms really early in evolution. That means that things like octopi, which have been shown to be really intelligent, good at solving problems, and demonstrate several criteria that psychologists, and I did my postdoc in psychology, so once upon a time I knew some of this, say is self-awareness. Octopi demonstrate self-awareness in some ways, but they do it with a nervous system and a thinking capacity fundamentally different than vertebrates and all the bilaterally symmetrical organisms on life. You put all this stuff together, and we are trying to understand and manage a system that works in much more different ways than most of us think about in our daily life. And these kinds of differences at the start may be the most fundamental challenge to science, to stop thinking the ocean works like land does, in terms of its physics, in terms of its chemistry, or in terms of its biology. Basic laws are still the same, but the details of how things are done underneath those basic outcomes can be really different. The IPCC learned this the hard way. If you go back to Assessment Report 1, in the 400-odd pages of the whole thing, they do have a 22-page chapter on the coupled ocean climate system. 22 pages on the whole set of connections. They've got a page and a half on ocean processes and ocean models linking the ocean to climate. 2 pages on how those models were validated. They do look at the ocean, but barely in passing. By Assessment Report 5, they've got 62 pages, and this is just Working Group 1 on the physics. This is not Working Group 2 on adaptation or 3 on mitigation. Observations on the ocean, 62 pages. Sea level rise, change, and how the physics of that through ocean warming plus the melting of cryosphere fields 80 pages just on that one process and its link to climate change. And between a fifth and a quarter or a third of a whole lot of other chapters on the ocean. And now I'm part of the team of authors to do a whole special report on the ocean and cryosphere for IPCC before Assessment Report 6, because people are beginning to understand how important the ocean is to climate change. And this is one of the big challenges to ocean science. Many of you have seen variants of this picture. And I did for a long time before I really thought seriously about the messages in it. This is about how heat moves on the planet. There's a little bit of heat that gets blown around in the atmosphere. And we call those trivial things hurricanes and cyclones and thunderstorms and stuff like that. To compare it to the actual amount of heat on the planet that's moved by the ocean. These red lines, the major surface currents, and then up between Greenland and Norway, how ocean processes, increasing salinity and decreasing temperature, make it cold, make it heavier, sink to the seafloor, then those blue return currents until it gets warmer, less saline, and comes up again. This cycle, which has been estimated to take 500 years to complete from one point back to the return, is slowing down. That's really well documented. The sinking rate is slowing down. That means less and less heat is being taken off the surface of the waters into the deep ocean. The implications of that for surface warming of the oceans, that warm pool to the west of Central and South America, and its impacts on climate that many of you know. This is just the beginning. Understanding that, knowing if anything can be done to mitigate, and though finding out what has to be done to adapt is a huge challenge. So that went backwards. There we are. Ocean acidification didn't even get mentioned in Assessment Report 1, and even by Assessment Report 5, that's the first time ocean acidification got anything more than a paragraph scattered here and there as something that had been documented and needed to be investigated. From 4 to 5, one 6 or 7 year cycle of the IPCC, ocean acidification emerged enough that it got a whole paragraph in the summary for policymakers. And anybody who's been involved in knowing how you have to take, in the case of the last IPCC report, 1,700 pages of science and distill it down to 20 or 30 pages of a summary for policymakers, to give it a whole paragraph and to give it a whole figure showing how much has changed in such a short time. This is highlighting ocean acidification is one of those things that is now incontrovertible that it's happening. It will increase the more that we fail to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We're already documenting that it's affecting the biology, life history, and productivity of at least calcium-demanding shellfish and crustaceans and marine life with calcium-based exoskeletons. And that's only the beginning of what we're learning about this one consequence of climate change that one cycle of assessment reports ago barely warranted a mention. and in 1990, when the first one was done, wasn't even known to exist. All the assessment scenarios in Working Group 1 of the last assessment report included acidification as one of the things that they were trying to forecast. A whole section of the chapter on ocean observations was just about pH and how it's changing. A whole section of the scenarios and all kinds of figures. Adaptation, and the adaptation Working Group 2 part of the last assessment report. These are just some of the highlights that you can pull out of that report as adaptation challenges that ecosystems and people who depend on marine ecosystems either directly for livelihoods or indirectly because, oh, by the way, marine ecosystems do produce half the oxygen we breathe, take out a lot of the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. All these factors require some kind of adaptation strategy. And they go all the way from changes in organism physiology and organism behavior up to the population dynamics. And it's almost certain to be the case that as they carry through what it's doing for the dynamics of populations that are documented to be vulnerable to ocean acidification, we're going to find whole ecosystem processes are going to be affected by that. These are some pretty, we could make the same argument about fisheries, and we've been working 50 years to deal with adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies for the impacts of fisheries on ecosystems. We don't have 50 years to sort this out for things like ocean acidification. And this is, I don't pick this because ocean acidification is the singular most important aspect of climate change and the ocean. I pick it because it's illustrative of new things continuing to crop up with everything we've already studied about the ocean. This is something that only got attention in the last decade to 15 years. New things will keep cropping up. Confidence that the change is occurring is really high. But we've got a very short time series. You saw that in the figure that I showed 2 slides ago. A really short time series to figure out what's going on. And so we don't know very much about the rate of change, the trajectory it's going to follow, and particularly whether or not it has any nonlinearities, either in terms of the rate of acidification itself. It could be that there are buffering capacities in the ocean that are keeping the rate to the relatively slow level it is now. And if those buffering capacities are exceeded, it could accelerate quickly. Or it could be there may be buffering mechanisms that haven't kicked in yet because we haven't yet violated some biological boundary that has feedbacks built into it. This is the kind of question you have to ask, not just about ocean acidification, but these new things that are being found about the ocean in a changing climate. Are there going to be nonlinearities in the future? And if so, which way? Because the proper adaptation strategy, the proper mitigation measures will be different depending on what kinds of nonlinearities are in these ecological relationships. And there's another important thing. This is just the physics. This figure back here is just the pH and carbon dioxide, physics and chemistry, the hardest of the sciences. the causality of ocean acidification to CO2 concentrations in the ocean is well established. The increase in CO2 concentration in the ocean to greenhouse gas emissions on land took 4 to 5 assessment reports to get solidified to the point where there was a full, strong scientific consensus on those linkages. That's the physics and the chemistry. As we then look at the biological effects of the pH change, the attribution of causality gets weaker, saying this change in this physiological process of this animal is because of pH. You can do lab experiments and establish that. When you get to the life history properties of that population, was it the pH, or was it they made behavioral changes because of the change in pH, and that behavioral change led to the population dynamics consequence. And then when you take the population dynamics consequence to the ecosystem consequence, the attribution of causality keeps getting weaker. One of the biggest messages from the IPBES assessments that we did not expect when we started them, not about ocean climate change, but about the changes in, say, land use to the changes in biodiversity. That attribution of causality is difficult to make. The changes in biodiversity to the changes in human well-being is, well, the changes in biodiversity to the human uses of biodiversity is much harder to show the causal links because there's many more possibilities to why their pattern of change occurred. It could be not the biodiversity effect, but the fact that the biodiversity changed in a way that made other choices more efficient for the human uses. It was no longer necessary to grow this crop because some other crop would grow better. The causality got weaker. And then showing that human well-being was degraded by this change in land use, several links in the change earlier, got even harder to demonstrate. And this may be one of the biggest challenges to ocean science. I threw this figure together to try to give you an ideogram of what I'm trying to explain. In general, and even more for the ocean than land, for those reasons that I spent time on at the beginning, we don't live in the ocean, so we don't perceive the ocean dynamics in ways that are as real as we perceive terrestrial dynamics. The yellow arrows are the strength of our ability to attribute causality to change. So from change in a physical property to change in the physical system dynamics. We're pretty good at being able to document causality. Going from changes in the physical and chemical system dynamics to biological population impacts, our ability to attribute causality gets weaker. From biological impacts to ecosystem structure and function, rather than a specific piece of biology, causality and the attribution of causality weakens again. From ecosystem impacts to human uses, causality weakens again. From human uses to human well-being, causality weakens again. Now, what are those red arrows? That's the policy effectiveness of making an argument. If you can demonstrate human well-being changes, you can get the attention of policymakers pretty quickly. If you have to get them to link it to human uses, change this human use is affecting human well-being in this way, we're pretty good at that piece of causality, showing how changes in fisheries, changes in shipping, or coastal tourism affect well-being? Causality is pretty strong. From human uses to the impacts of human activities on ecosystems, causality weakens. It's hard to get measures to manage fishery bycatch until you have really strong documentation that you're affecting the population, not just killing a few albatross. And then from ecosystem impacts to biological impacts, system dynamics, causality to, if you're trying to motivate policy because of a change in a physical property like ocean pH, that's really hard to have policy impact at the level where the science is the easiest to demonstrate. That's another real science challenge. We've done things to try to meet these challenges. And I'm going to go quickly through this part of the talk so we can get out in time to get to some drinks and have a reception. One of the things we've done is actually really worked hard to strengthen the information base about the ocean. And I'm going to be very nasty to many, many important and committed initiatives by focusing just on the global ocean observing system as illustrative of the type of thing we're trying to do, with no insult intended to many other initiatives that are comparable. Goose got started way back in the 80s when I was about older than most of you still. I hate to say. I was an early career to mid-career scientist in the 80s when Goose got started. And I say they're visionaries because I was not part of them. IOC, UNESCO, and Salvatore, we've had the privilege of hearing, coordinates it. Goose has a lot of participating member countries. The data streams that Goose has produced are the foundation for a huge amount of the important work on the role of the ocean in climate change and our understanding of climate change overall. I'll skip this slide because it would take me about 10 minutes to explain all the really important things that it has in it, but you can go access this, and when you're feeling like you really need to punish yourself, you can figure out all the things that it says. The Argo, which is a key part of Goose, is the Argo buoy system, records a lot of essential ocean variables. And this is not even a complete list of the types of ocean variables for which Goose is trying to provide us a spatially resolved and temporally resolved time series over an increasingly long period of time. And there's one on ocean biology that includes the abundance of a lot of kinds of animals, composition of structure-forming features of the marine habitat, and all of you know enough about marine ecology to know how important things like corals, sponges, the structure-forming biology that makes habitat are to ocean dynamics. Ocean chemistry, ocean physics, all these things are part of the data stream that Argo and Goose are trying to present. And they're called essential ocean variables for some very good reasons. I don't have time to tell you all the things that are done with them, but these are just a few of the things that would not have been able to have been fully resolved, at least at the spatial and temporal scale we've been able to, without the data streams from systems like Goose, the carbon budget of the ocean, and the things that we've been able to quantify from it. The global water cycle, the movement of water, that 97% of the water that's in the ocean, to the 3% that keeps life on land alive. That global water cycle. The global energy balances between solar radiation coming in, reflectivity of the 70% of the world that's ocean, the cryosphere that's linked to the ocean in the polar and high altitude areas, and the many things that we are already able to explain about the biosphere because of what Goose has been able to give us about the ocean. This is a figure that I kidnapped from a workshop I was invited to earlier this year that I participated in remotely, but it was a really good discussion of where Goose needs to go in terms of getting more of its data streams incorporated in the types of global assessments, the World Ocean Assessment that Alan Simcock will talk to you about, the IPBES assessments that I've been involved with, and the World Ocean Assessment I was involved in. These set of different rings, if you look at the axes, they are resolution in, I believe it's, spatial scale on the x-axis, temporal scale on the y-axis. And they're trying to cover, quite understandably, local spatial scales at short time periods, larger spatial scales, longer time periods, but a full continuity of change in all those essential ocean variables with these overlapping circles. And I won't read the labels for the many of you who probably can't see them, but again, the slides will be available to you, and it's worth looking at this figure to see how comprehensively we're working to quantify things in the ocean. Are we succeeding? Partially. Can we get better? Absolutely. But people that tell you we don't know anything about the ocean, or we know a tiny bit about the ocean, we know a lot about the ocean already. We know enough to make a lot better policies and develop a lot better implementation strategies than we have a track record of doing to this point. And this is an important slide to spend some time on. Now, to get us out, I'll skip this one. But this shows, for example, the value of investing in data. The figure here, the ups and downs of those, the blue and the red time series on those two charts look almost identical. What's the difference that makes the blue line much larger than the red line? And what's the variable that's being plotted? The variable is the variance in the prediction that's being made with an ocean model. And the difference is adding one more sensor to quantifying the trend. You've halved the error just by increasing the number of measurements you're able to take. And anybody who's got a science background, to be shown how you can halve the error, it's not that there's a bias you've corrected, but the variance that you're able to attach to what you're trying to measure just got cut in half. And if we go back to that little ideogram I showed you, if you've got the task of trying to attribute causality, think how much more effective you're going to be able to make that argument with half the error in your measurements. This is the type of thing that people who are involved in that really boring thing called monitoring, why those of us who wouldn't touch monitoring with a 10-foot, with a 3-meter pole, owe our massive debt of gratitude to the people who do, because they make our life so much more effective. And this is another illustration. In this case, it's a slightly different type of analysis, where the difference, again, it's not where the peaks occur in the annual cycle or the multi-annual cycle. It's how well resolved the peaks are in the lower figure compared to how we've been able to identify the peaks in this event in the upper figure. And the plot there, again, shows the difference in how clear the areas of concern are just by increasing the density of measurement. You have to support efforts to improve monitoring, as unglamorous as it is, because every time you do, you increase the quality of the information you have to make the policy arguments that need to be made. This is a little figure about what an Argo buoy does. If you don't know, it's really interesting and you should go read the slide. But again, I won't take the time to show you. Yeah, it spends a couple hours at the water surface broadcasting all the data it's collected for the last, I can't remember, the number of hours is down there. Then it sinks to a few thousand meters, collects data as it drifts, sinks a few thousand more meters, collects more data, comes to the surface, broadcasts the data, does it all over again. And this is the coverage of the world's ocean right now. This is a pretty impressive start on information we need to help manage the ocean, if we were just able to use it. And where you do use it, you can draw some pictures like this one, which I can assure you, because I was at the meeting, get attention of policymakers. This is the places in the world's oceans where the water temperatures were high enough to trigger alarms for corals, either surface corals or deep water corals. And yellow are areas of concern, and then it gets redder. It goes from areas of concern to areas of serious impact already. Policymakers pay attention when they see this is what's happening to the coral reefs that your tourism industry depends on. It's not cheap to do this. These are just some figures, and I won't read down the list. It's another set of factoids that you should take home. This is not cheap to do this stuff. It's just a whole lot cheaper than not doing it and then being surprised by the consequences and having to deal with them after the fact. And this is a message that's hard to get across to the funding world, but it's fundamental. This isn't some fancy new theory. This is information. And this is just a list of some of the other initiatives, many linked to Goose, that I could have spent as much time and said as many positive things about. We're addressing the challenges of the ocean by getting better information. And we're also using that information to understand how specific biological properties and ecosystems as a whole are changing naturally and even more importantly through the impacts of the ways that we're using them. I intentionally am going to take and try to get through this really quickly, even though it's something I would love to talk about for hours because it's really fascinating. Something like fish stock dynamics, which is one of the first things in the ocean we actually did try as scientists to understand. And we tried 100 years ago. By the 1930s, there was a mature field of fisheries science already working on things like identifying what we now call maximum sustainable yield and a lot of other factors. The track record of managing fisheries was pretty abysmal right up until the 1990s. And since then, it's improved almost everywhere that there's the capacity to do science and apply management. But that came at the cost of making the problems we have to solve a whole lot more complicated, because we went from just trying to manage individual fish stocks to acknowledging oceanography matters. The state of the ocean that the fish is in matters. Climate's a driver in addition to fishing, and we need to look at it. And we had to acknowledge there's a social science dimension to sustainable fisheries that until it's acknowledged and until it's made a fundamental part of fisheries science, you can't make progress on sustainable fisheries management. I'm not going to talk about social sciences today because next week you have Tony Charles, who's a close friend and colleague, and will say everything I could say clearer, better, and in half the time, and add a lot more to it. Now, this is a figure from 1967. They were already looking at data and looking at models that would try to explain what's making fish populations respond the way they are, and how should we be exploiting them to make them sustainable. And 1967 is probably earlier than everybody other than the first row was born. This has been going on a long time. And there's a logic here that I'm always surprised a lot of people aren't aware of. That on an unexploited stock, it's not very productive. There's a big biomass, but because of density-dependent processes, there's a very low productivity. As you reduce the biomass from the unexploited level, you loosen the density-dependent processes, which make productivity grow up. And both dimensions of productivity, growth of living individuals and the fecundity when they come time to spawn, because they've got more energy per capita to store and invest in spawning. And that goes on for quite a while, surprisingly, until you've got the biomass reduced about 60%, down to about 40% of unexploited biomass. You keep getting gains in productivity with less standing stock. And then you suddenly run into, now there aren't enough spawners left to maximally produce the number of recruits you need for the future. And this is that curvilinearity in the stock recruitment relationship that was known 80 years ago, was quantitatively being investigated 50 years ago, and it's the cornerstone of where the maximum sustainable yield is, where you've maximized that productivity without decreasing the number of spawners enough to be paying a price in lost future recruitment. That's a really logical way to think. And that's what's in the law of the sea, as you have to find that maximum sustainable yield and keep the stock in that neighborhood. Sounds simple, but we make the problem complicated right away. And nature makes it even more complicated right away. If we're successfully managing a stock around what we think is the maximum biomass associated maximum sustainable yield, what are we doing? We're making sure we only get data points in a narrow range of the stock. So we get less and less information about, is the density dependence of productivity changing? We don't know because we don't let the stock get large. Where's the curvilinearity? Where's the tipping point? That means if we transgress it, we're going to be down the tubes quickly. We don't know because we're trying to keep the stock from ever getting there. So we're making it harder and harder to get the information we need for good management. And then nature is making the stock, even when we're being successful at keeping the stock in the right size, it keeps making the stock occasionally a whole lot bigger unexpectedly for reasons we have no idea, or drops really quickly for reasons we're equally poor at explaining. This is a kind of situation that a priori the precautionary approach was designed to address. There's moderate to high uncertainty in the actual shape of that relationship. Those were all those lines in that earlier figure. All of them fit the data almost equally well, but they were really different. Part of it's because there's estimation accuracy, incomplete knowledge, another reason for the caution. Processes have an inherently high variability. And there will be serious or irreversible harm from a management error. All the things you need to justify application of precaution. Why is that not a sufficient solution to the problem? Just be more precautionary. I'm going to digress and waste valuable time telling you a personal anecdote. Back in the early 2000s, when I was being brought in to more serious level of policy, our government decided, some policymakers at the top of the government were seeing the health ministry and the environment ministry dealing with contaminants, applying the precautionary principle. And fisheries, agriculture, and forestry were applying the precautionary approach. The government would say, why do we have two names? Well, first of all, why are we doing two different things? And we, oh, well, they're not really different. They are different in some important ways, and that's a discussion for later. But they said, we want a working group across the science-based departments to sort out one explanation of what precaution means in decision-making for the Canadian government. That was a pretty nice thing to be asked to do. We have 5 science-based departments in our government: agriculture, fisheries and oceans, environment and climate change, natural resources, which is forestry, mining, things like that, and health. I thought I'd be in a working group run by our Privy Council office with 5 departments. There were 14 departments sitting at the table at that working group. Why were they there? 9 departments of government were used to dealing with precaution as a non-tariff trade barrier, being applied by countries which didn't want to allow access to their markets. So they said, we're going to take the precautionary approach because we're not sure of the safety of your manufactured products or your products in trade. This is the reality. When you're going to work in decision-making, you're going to have to deal with the reality that trade ministries are going to take something that's straightforward to an environment ministry as precaution and say, you show the reasons why we have to take these actions. Not just say, well, we're uncertain, so we'll do less. That's the reality of working in government. We developed a precautionary approach for managing fisheries. And we have a limit, we have a precautionary buffer, we have an upper limit on fishing mortality. This is stock status, this is exploitation rate. When stock status falls below a certain level, fishing mortality has to be 0. This is a precautionary buffer based on the statistical uncertainty in the assessment and a buffer thrown in for how ineffective we think the management may be in responding when we give them advice. So you start advising a reduction in exploitation when you hit the precautionary buffer rather than waiting until you hit the limit. And then if there's a target being set, it has to be sufficiently far from the cautionary buffer that they can manage around the target, deal with year-to-year variation without continually straying into the precautionary area. Makes good sense. Any of you who work in Europe see the same thing. A lot, Australia, New Zealand, this is basic. When I was a Canadian member of the International Council for Exploration of the Seas, Fisheries Advisory Committee, when ICES did that for Europe. For I think there were 75 fish stocks. They developed reference points for biomass and fishing mortality. That's the B and the F, the limit and precautionary reference point. This is the list from that stock recruit plot I showed you at the beginning, the number of different ways that those values were identified across those 70 stocks. Every time it was the same group of experts with the same starting data, but there was no consistency in what made sense from stock to stock. Try taking this diversity of ways to do a straightforward job to a bunch of decision makers and expect them to take the output as serious, sound science. There are compromises that have to be made, and they're comparable. This was the best science applied stock by stock, and it meant you did different things all over the place. When we went back with a more consistent way of doing the job that was not the most appropriate for each individual stock, it had much more impact right away. This is another challenge for science. Back in UNCLOS, when it says use the best available science, does that mean make a case-specific solution to every ecological problem and it will be unique, and you have to sell them over and over again on a unique solution? Or do you make some compromises on the best to increase the impact of the outcome? And that's a challenge you have to deal with. It was perceived initially as inconsistent, therefore possibly arbitrary, had little impact. And we had to get much more explicit, much more consistent about what we did and why we did it to make a difference. When we start adding these things about climate change and environmental variability afterwards, because remember when I said we're trying to get better at explaining the variability? We took those individual parameters, like the limit this came from a meeting I was at February this year. We took that one parameter, and it is now a three-dimensional probability density function depending on the climate regime in place for this set of stocks. We've made the problem phenomenally more complex. We've captured what we think are important things about the climate drivers on stock dynamics. But we took a problem that was hard to sell to policymakers and made a data point a three-dimensional probability density function. Do you think we're going to get quick uptake by the policymakers in acting on that? And this is not something unique to fish stock assessment, because the ecosystem approach makes us realize we're not just trying to manage the exploitation of fish stocks sustainably, we're trying to manage the impact of human activities on ecosystem structure and function in general sustainably. We can take the lessons we've learned from this three-stage model for the really, really simple case that we've been working on for nearly 100 years, making fish stock assessment, fish stock management sustainable, and try to generalize it. And this is going to be the challenge your generation has to pick up and run with. Study why it was hard to solve the problem with fish stock assessments, why this new dimension of adding in oceanographic conditions, climate change variability, has just upped the ante of complexity a whole lot. And apply that more generally. The assumptions of that three-stage model for fish management are all laid out. I won't read them to you, but they're explicit. Every one of those assumptions can be rewritten simply as, instead of spawning stock biomass and recruitment as what we're trying to manage, an ecosystem structural property, because biomass of an individual population is a structural property of an ecosystem. Recruitment is the function that serves producing fish in the next generation. A structure property, a functional property. You take any structural property of the ecosystem, any function that you can logically demonstrate and empirically demonstrate is linked to the structure. And then you have these assumptions underlying the three-stage model generalize. You have to be able to say what the damage state of the function is, and then what state of the structural property is associated with the occurrence of that loss of the function. And this makes what property crucial every time. It's that nonlinearity, that tipping point between the structure and the function, that over this very large range of biomass, the only thing that we really need to know is that. This is the challenge you face in all the other structural and functional activities you deal with, is where is that nonlinearity between the structural and the functional property, and how far do you have to stay away from it to keep the activity sustainable? And if you can do that, and here are some illustrations of real data from real habitat resilience, habitat feature of the seabed, the resilience of the system to exploitation. A good structural functional relationship has that curvilinearity. And there are ways to put that into place. Do we have time to go into that, or are we close to done? Time?
Hi, almost there.
Almost there. One of the things fisheries has done, my last comments and then I'll wrap up. For those of you who work in fisheries, you've probably heard of management strategy evaluations. This is how we're bringing in the social sciences, the ecosystem dynamics. We're making hypotheses about how the whole system works, and then running simulations, which climate change taught us how to, modeling taught us how to do, to simulate if the ecosystem works this way, and human behavior makes these choices, this is the trajectory. And you do that 1,000 times. And then you make another hypothesis about how the ecosystem works. Another hypothesis of how humans will react. Run it 1,000 times. And we can use the power of modeling and statistics to do evaluations of management strategies to see which ones are sustainable and which ones aren't. This is a real world case, and it's a simple one. There's only, 9, I think, different scenarios that were being explored. 3 different hypotheses for how the ecosystem worked, 3 different hypotheses for how the harvesters could act and could be managed to act. manage them through effort control, managing them through yield control, manage them through spatial exclusions. What will happen? We can simulate all that in a computer. What are the outcomes? That is a little extra complication. Here's 6 different outcomes, all of which some stakeholders wanted to be achieved for that resource. Because, again, when Tony comes in, and we'll talk more about the importance of bringing in stakeholders and their values, their desires to decision making. 6 different outcomes, all of which people wanted. 9 different scenarios for achieving each of the 6. What does it mean? This is the minimum amount of information we're supposed to take to the decision makers to have them make a choice, because you can only manage the fishery with one of those strategies at a given time. And the world is only going to make the ecosystem work one of those possible ways at a given time. Now, we don't know which one it's going to be, but we can show the risks of achieving the different objectives. This is going to be the challenge if we take a totally empirical, knowledge-based way to have evidence-based decision-making. We've got to figure out ways to make policymakers look at a figure like this in that 30 seconds in the elevator and know what decision they want to make. I challenge any of you to know what decision should be made if we give you 30 minutes and you can see the slide on your screen so you can actually see what the axes are. These are the challenges that we face, the things that have crept in to something as simple as making a single fishery sustainable on a single fish stock in a variable ecosystem with a lot of stakeholders all having an investment in that outcome. And I will skip for now, and we have lots of breakout sessions where we can talk about this, the issues of what influences the impact of science on policy. This is really important, and all I will do is highlight this now almost ancient document from about, 2009, 2011? Salvatore, again, was involved in its production. The assessment of assessments looked very specifically at looked at hundreds of assessments and evaluated their effectiveness in ocean assessments, their effectiveness in policy. And it highlights the fact that you need, yes, there they are. Credibility, the science community has to support it. Not a scientist likes it and publishes it in Science, but the science community as a whole stands behind it. Legitimacy. The people whose lives are going to be changed by the decision that's made have to feel the process that produced it was both scientifically sound and gave their concerns fair consideration in the science advice. And then relevance. The policymaker has to feel you answered the question they ask you, not the question you wish they'd ask you, which is one of the nastiest things a scientist can do to a policymaker, is go off and say, you asked me the wrong question, so I'll answer the right one. You can bury the right question in your answer to the wrong one. But if you haven't answered the question they want answered, you haven't done your job. You can educate them about what else they need to know, but you can't say you know more about policymaking than the people you're advising. So those 3 properties have to be part of science if you want science to have an impact. And in the assessment of assessments, you've got best practices written right out for all these aspects of getting credibility, legitimacy, and relevance to your work. So this is a very good place to go read. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for 3 questions. Before we move, 1, 2, 3. Now we need a mic.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I'm Whitney, I'm from the United States, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. At the very beginning, you mentioned a necessity to decouple socioeconomic and environmental degradation. And how often in future policymaking do you think that this nexus will be a trade-off versus these things can increase in their well-being together?
The longer we make it a zero-sum game, the more everybody loses. Even if 50% of the time the trade-off goes in favor of the environment, and 50% of the time the trade-off goes in favor of people's well-being, that means half the time people will suffer, half the time the environment will suffer, and degradation will continue. This is what the decoupling has to mean. It has to mean we have to stop just showing the status, continuing to do what we're doing is bad. We have to find pathways that actually allow greater human use of the ocean with less environmental impact. I am sick to death of people flooding me with papers about how, well, we have to go from 10% of the ocean and marine protected areas to 20 to 30. We have to find ways to make our use of the ocean have less impact, greater ability of the system to recover from the short-term impacts. Aside from toxic pollutants, those pathways always exist. We're almost never interested in finding them. We're interested in proving that a current activity is bad, so it should stop. And that's unhelpful to building a better future. I completely believe, after co-chairing the IPBES assessment, regional assessment for the Americas, successful strategies to decouple growth from degradation and allow growth do exist, but they're based on less consumption, greater value to non-consumptive uses of the world, less waste of the things we're already taking. We waste 40% of the carbohydrates and protein taken from nature as food. Never gets into human well-being. 40%. These are fixable problems.
Okay, there was somebody here.
Hi, I'm Aline. I'm from Brazil. And I wonder about the unreported data about fishing, especially on artisanal fishery. I just wanted to know what you think about this unreported statistic on the fishing stocks, and how you see about kinds of countries who can continue some monitoring program about it, as Brazil, for example.
Excellent question, thank you. Both of them were, incidentally, I should have acknowledged in both cases. I've been very impressed with how small-scale fisheries went from only being mentioned in the back corner to being on the priority for groups like FAO, the CBD, and groups like that in less than 10 years. This is small-scale fisheries and the livelihoods that they support, the amount of human well-being in mostly lower-income parts of the world is now acknowledged as an issue. And if you read some of the recent things, like the guidelines that the FAO has produced on small-scale fisheries, it's impressive how much we do now know about their importance and ways that they can be helped in self-governance and in greater benefits being accrued through the correction of some practices, because artisanal fisheries, don't ever kid yourself that they are environmentally benign. The most damaging gears used in fishing are only used in artisanal fisheries. Dynamites and poison are both, in some parts of the world, constant tools used in small-scale artisanal fishing. They need support in making practices that they like to present, they like to follow, able to survive in an increasingly globalized and increasingly technologically sophisticated world. When I started my career on fisheries in Newfoundland, where everybody's heard of the small-scale fisheries and the cod fisheries and the horrible cod collapse, almost no one has ever read in any paper published that when you talk to the small-scale fishers, all of them agree that in 1988, an early version of this came out. It was a very early GIS system, and every small-scale fishery could afford a $20 GIS on their boat. That suddenly, as one of the most experienced fishermen in Newfoundland said, it made every 16-year-old kid as good at locating and recording the best fishing areas off the coast as someone who had done it for 60 years. Because all they had to do was get one good fish catch, punch in the coordinates, and instead of taking 40 years of fishing with their father to line up this landmark 8 kilometers away and this landmark, look at the current this way, they go to their GPS coordinates and they're there. Technology and globalization will not go away. Don't ever think of a solution that doesn't acknowledge both of those realities. And within that, there are things, and Tony Charles next week and some of the other speakers will give you a huge amount of information on ways to make these small-scale livelihoods that are essential to huge parts of the world where there are no alternatives sustainable.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Leopoldo, a postdoc here at the University of São Paulo. And whereas I agree with and highly acknowledge the challenges facing stock assessments and how you translate that to policy, for countries such as Brazil and other perhaps tropical countries, there is even a greater conundrum when it comes to the access and existence of information on fish stocks. So I'd like you to explore this conundrum. Data poor, is there any room for data poor management, or what are the tools? Because of course, for instance, in Brazil, the last national fishery statistics is from 10 years ago, something like that. So how to connect policy in a data poor context?
There are 2 parts to any reasonable answer to that question. One is, don't be satisfied with being data poor. everything from UNCLOS and the Fish Stocks Agreement, the FAO Code of Conduct on Sustainable Fisheries. It is not an option. It is an obligation of every country that regulates fishing to collect information and make it available. It is an obligation under international and often national law to do it. And groups like Jeff, FAO, and the World Bank are funding projects to do it. If your government is still resisting doing it, get the allies to make them realize this is not a choice they can make or not make. This is an obligation under the law of the sea, and there are resources to do it. In the meantime, there are very effective options in the management strategy evaluation framework. When you're data poor but have some data, making the hypotheses you're exploring with your computer models be hypotheses that can be shown to be more or less valid with what little data you can have. And that means the hypotheses that are most likely to be true, given the little data you have, are at least a basis to start sound fisheries management. And those kinds of computer analyses also can often tell you, of all the data that you can collect, these are the key data that will enable you to reduce the uncertainty the most, the fastest.
Okay, so we are almost in the end of the day. I would like to ask a round of applause to Jake Rice. Thank you very much, Jake, for sharing your expertise and your thoughts about this challenging issue.